The dust had not yet settled on the grave of Thomas Kingsley when Calvin Garrett rode into Redemption Creek with murder in his heart and a loaded Colt revolver on his hip. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Redemption Creek, nestled in the high desert scrubland of southern New Mexico territory, was the kind of place that swallowed men whole and spit out only their boots. The buildings along the main thoroughfare were weathered to a uniform silver gray, bleached by a sun that showed no mercy and softened by nothing, except the occasional mercy of an evening thunderstorm rolling in off the Guadalupe Mountains. Cattle drives passed through twice a year, leaving behind a brief season of noise and coin before the quiet settled back over everything like a wool blanket over a sleeping drunk. Calvin Garrett had ridden 300 miles to reach this town, and he had done it without stopping long enough to eat a proper meal or sleep more than a few hours at a stretch. His horse, a broad-chested roan named Copper who had carried him faithfully from a dozen forgettable towns in Texas, was leaner than Calvin liked to see him. Calvin himself was not much better. He was 31 years old, lean and sun-darkened, with deep-set gray eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. He wore a duster coat that had once been brown and was now the color of the earth itself, and a hat with a sweat-stained band that told the story of the last 2 weeks better than any words could. He had come for Thomas Kingsley. Thomas Kingsley owed Calvin Garrett a debt that went beyond money, though the money was part of it. 3 years ago, in a town called Laramie before Calvin had moved on to Texas, Thomas Kingsley had stood beside Calvin and sworn on the life of his mother that a land deal they were both invested in was legitimate. Calvin had put in every dollar he had, the savings of 5 years of cattle driving and fence mending, and every backbreaking form of honest labor the territory could offer a young man trying to make something of himself. Thomas had taken that money, and Thomas had vanished, and the land deal had turned out to be nothing more than paper and lies. But it was not only the money. Thomas Kingsley had also testified falsely against a friend of Calvin's, a man named Ruiz, during a dispute over water rights. That testimony had sent Ruiz to prison for 2 years, and Ruiz had died in that prison of a fever that a free man might have survived. Calvin had loved Ruiz like a brother, and the knowledge that Thomas Kingsley's lies had played a part in that death had lived in him like a splinter he could not reach. 3 years of tracking, 3 years of dead ends and wrong turns and men who swore they had seen Kingsley in one place only for the trail to go cold. And then, finally, a letter from a man in El Paso who had passed through Redemption Creek and seen Thomas Kingsley's name on a deed at the land office. Kingsley had apparently settled down, taken a wife, and become a respectable citizen in a town that did not know his history. Calvin had packed his things that same evening. He did not think about what he was going to do when he got there with any kind of specificity. He told himself he was going to demand an accounting. He told himself he was going to make Kingsley face what he had done. The revolver on his hip was something he did not examine too closely, because examining it would have required him to ask questions about himself that he was not ready to answer. He rode into Redemption Creek on a Tuesday afternoon. The October sun angled low and sharp, throwing long shadows across the street. He stopped at the water trough in front of the general store and let Copper drink while he pulled the folded letter from his coat pocket and read the address again. The Kingsley property was a half-mile east of town, a homestead with a farmhouse and a barn, according to his informant. Calvin watered his horse, allowed himself one long drink from his canteen, and then turned Copper east. The road out of town was rutted and dry. Scrub oak and mesquite lined the edges of it, and somewhere in the distance a hawk was making slow circles against the pale sky. Calvin rode with his jaw set and his hands loose on the reins, and he was so focused on what lay ahead of him that he almost did not notice the woman at first. She was standing in front of the farmhouse gate, which was set back from the road by perhaps 30 yards of hard-packed dirt. The house behind her was modest but well kept, with a porch that stretched across the front and a kitchen garden that had been carefully tended. There was a barn to the left and a chicken coop to the right. A windmill turned slowly in the afternoon breeze. It looked like a home that someone had put their heart into building. The woman was not tall, but she held herself in a way that made her seem so. She was dressed in a dark gray dress that Calvin recognized as mourning clothes, and her dark brown hair was pulled back simply with no vanity in it. She was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, with a face that might have been called pretty in easier circumstances, but which at that moment carried the particular severity of a woman who had recently been through something very hard. She was watching him ride toward her with eyes that were brown and direct and gave nothing away. Calvin slowed Copper to a walk as he approached. He pulled up at the gate and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and something happened in that moment that he could not have explained if anyone had asked him to. She stopped him cold before he reached the door, not with a weapon, not with a shout or a threat. She stopped him with nothing more than her presence and her eyes, and the fact that she was standing there at all, and the morning gray of her dress, and the way she held her chin up as though she was daring the world to knock it down. Calvin Garrett reined Copper to a full stop. "Can I help you?" the woman said. Her voice was steady, not unfriendly but not welcoming either. It was the voice of a woman who had been managing things alone and had gotten efficient at it. Calvin found that he could not immediately remember what he had ridden 300 miles to say. He cleared his throat. "I am looking for Thomas Kingsley," he said. "Is this his property?" Something moved across her face. It was brief and controlled, but Calvin had spent enough years reading people in difficult situations to catch it. It was grief, sharp and fresh, just barely held in check. "It was," she said. The two words landed on Calvin like a physical thing. "Was," he repeated. "Thomas Kingsley was my husband," she said, and there was a dignity in how she said it that made the words heavier still. "He passed 9 days ago, pneumonia. It came on fast." She paused. "I am Mary Kingsley." Calvin sat on his horse and looked at her, and he felt the ground shift underneath him in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. He had ridden 300 miles to find a man who was already in the ground. He had spent 3 years carrying this thing, and it had brought him here to a gate where a widow stood in mourning gray with grief in her brown eyes and nowhere left for his anger to go. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, because he was a man who had been raised to say the right thing even when he did not entirely mean it, and then he surprised himself by meaning it a little more than he expected. Mary Kingsley studied him. She was not a woman who accepted things at face value. That much was clear. "You did not come to offer condolences," she said. "What did you want with my husband?" Calvin removed his hat. He was not entirely sure why. It felt like the right thing to do, standing at the gate of a dead man's home and talking to his widow. He held the hat in both hands in front of him, turning the brim slowly. "It was a private matter," he said. "It is no longer relevant." "A private matter," she said, and something in her tone suggested that she had heard that phrase before and that it had never once meant something simple. "You rode here from somewhere. You look like you have been riding for days." That is not a man with a casual errand. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The hawk was still circling somewhere above them. "I had business with him," Calvin said. "From a long time ago. It does not concern you." "If it concerns my land and my home and my children, then it concerns me," she said, and the word children shifted something in Calvin's chest that he did not want to examine. "If you are here to collect a debt or to make a claim on this property, you should know that I have already had 2 men from the bank come by this week and I am managing it." "I am not from the bank," Calvin said. She waited. Calvin put his hat back on his head and looked out across the property. The windmill turned. The chickens moved around their yard with their particular purposeful foolishness. There was a vegetable garden with late-season squash still on the vine, and the fence line of the property was in good repair. Whoever had built this place had done it properly, and Calvin found himself with the strange, uncomfortable knowledge that Thomas Kingsley had managed to build something honest here, at the end, even if he had built it partly with money that was not his. "I am not here to cause trouble," Calvin said, and for the first time since leaving Texas, he meant that entirely. "I am sorry I came unannounced. I did not know about your husband's passing." Mary Kingsley's expression softened just slightly, just at the edges. "What is your name?" "Calvin Garrett." She considered the name. He watched her face for recognition and did not see any. Thomas had not told her then, which meant Thomas had either been ashamed or he had been careful or both. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "you look like you have not eaten a hot meal in some time. Your horse looks about the same." She glanced at Copper with something that was not quite sympathy but was close to it. "I have stew on the stove and there is room in the barn. You are welcome to stay the night and rest before you head back to wherever you came from." Calvin stared at her. "You are inviting me to stay." "I am inviting your horse to rest in my barn," she said, with a brief, dry quality to her voice that might, in other circumstances, have been almost humor. "You may stay as a consequence. This is the West, Mr. Garrett. We feed travelers." He should have said no. Every reasonable part of him understood that he should have said no, tipped his hat, turned Copper around, and ridden back the way he had come to figure out what to do with himself now that the purpose he had been carrying for 3 years had been taken from him. Instead, he heard himself say, "I am grateful, Mrs. Kingsley. Thank you." She pushed the gate open, and Calvin Garrett rode through it, and nothing that followed was what he had expected. He settled Copper in the barn, brushing him down with care and making sure he had water and feed before he tended to his own needs, because that was the way Calvin had always done things. The barn was clean and well organized. There were 2 other horses in the stalls, a sturdy bay work horse and a smaller gray mare. Tools hung on the walls in their proper places. A loft above held hay that had been cut and stored with attention. Everything about this property spoke of sustained and careful effort. While he was working with Copper, a child appeared in the barn doorway. The child was a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with his mother's brown eyes and a serious expression that sat oddly on such a young face. He had clearly been crying recently, though he was not crying now. "You are the man Mama invited in," the boy said. "I am," Calvin said. "My name is Calvin Garrett. What is yours?" "Henry Kingsley," the boy said, with the particular gravity of a child who had recently been required to grow up faster than he should have had to. "My papa just died." "I know," Calvin said. "I heard. I am sorry about your papa." Henry considered this. "Lots of people say they are sorry. Mostly they are strangers who did not know him." "That is true of me as well," Calvin said, which was the most honest thing he could have said. Henry came into the barn and stood watching Calvin brush Copper. After a moment he said, "That is a good horse. What is his name?" "Copper," Calvin said. "He has carried me a long way." "Where from?" "Texas, most recently." Henry's eyes widened slightly at the geography of it. Texas was another world from Redemption Creek, the way all distant places are another world to a child. "That is far," he said. "It is," Calvin agreed. There was also a younger child, a girl named Ada who was 5 and who appeared at the barn door after her brother, peered at Calvin with enormous dark eyes, and then retreated to the house without saying anything. Calvin watched her go and felt something complicated move through him. He went to the house when Copper was settled, and Mary Kingsley fed him a bowl of thick venison stew with cornbread on the side and strong coffee that had been on the stove long enough to mean business. He ate at a kitchen table that was scrubbed clean, in a kitchen that was warm from the stove and had dried herbs hanging from the rafters and a window over the basin that looked out toward the mountains in the last of the evening light. Mary sat across from him with her own cup of coffee and watched him eat with the assessment of a woman who had learned to judge people quickly by necessity. "You are wondering what I am really doing here," Calvin said, when he had gotten enough food in him to feel human again. "I am wondering several things about you," she said. "I am wondering what your business with my husband was. I am wondering why you look like a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and I am wondering what you intend to do now that you have arrived." He set down his spoon. He looked at her directly because she seemed like a woman who deserved directness. Your husband and I had a dispute years ago in Wyoming territory. He owed me money, a significant amount. He also did something that contributed to the death of a man I cared about. He said it plainly without embellishment. I spent 3 years tracking him here. Mary's face was still, but her hands around the coffee cup tightened slightly. You came here intending to confront him. Yes. With that revolver on your belt. He did not answer that which was itself an answer. Mary Kingsley looked at him for a long, measuring moment. I am not going to pretend that surprises me entirely, she said finally. Thomas had things in his past that he did not speak about. I knew there were things. I did not know what they were. She paused. He was a different man here than he must have been then. I want you to know that. He worked this land with his hands. He was a good father. Whatever he did before he came here, he was trying to make it right by living differently. He was a good father, Calvin said quietly. I saw that, in the boy, in how this place is kept. He never mentioned the money, she said. The debt to you, whatever it was. He must have known you might come eventually, but he never told me. She looked down at her coffee. We are not well off, Mr. Garrett. We are comfortable because Thomas worked very hard. There is no cache of money hidden somewhere. What is here is what he built. I did not come for money, Calvin said, and realized only as he said it that it was entirely true, that somewhere along the road the money had become the least of what he had been seeking. I came because I needed him to face what he did, and I needed to face what I was carrying because of it. He was quiet for a moment. I cannot collect a debt from a dead man, and I cannot make a dead man account for his actions, so I suppose I need to figure out what to do with the rest of it on my own. They sat in silence for a while. The children were in the other room. Calvin could hear Henry's voice, low and serious, telling his little sister something, and Ada's occasional responses. The lamp on the table burned between Calvin and Mary, and outside the wind moved through the mesquite. Ruiz, Calvin said eventually. The man who died. He had a family, a wife and 2 daughters in Laramie. I sent them money when I could over the years because there was no one else to. He looked at his hands on the table. I could not give them back what they lost. I could only give them what I had. Mary looked at him with something new in her expression, something that was not quite what he had seen there before. That was kind, she said. It was not enough, he said. Kindness rarely is, she said. That does not make it less. He stayed the night in the barn, as offered, on a bedroll laid over clean hay with his saddle for a pillow, and he slept better than he had in 2 weeks, which told him something about exhaustion and something else about the particular quality of the peace in that place. In the morning, Mary was already in the kitchen when he came in to return the blanket she had loaned him. She had coffee ready and biscuits in the oven, and Henry was at the table doing sums on a slate, and little Ada was feeding the chickens through the kitchen window with a seriousness that suggested the fate of the chickens depended entirely on her precision. I should go, Calvin said, standing at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands. Mary looked at him from the stove. You have nowhere urgent to be now, she said. It was not a question. No, he admitted. Then go if you need to, she said. Or stay for breakfast at the least. She looked at him steadily. The fence on the east pasture is broken in 2 places. A coyote got one of my hens last week through a gap. Henry is too young to handle a full fence repair, and I cannot both manage the house and fix it myself. She said this matter-of-factly, without any quality of pleading in it. If you have some time and some willingness, the work is there. Calvin stood in the doorway and looked at her and thought about the open road and the 300 miles of Texas between him and the nearest thing he might call a life, which was not much of a life at all when he examined it. He thought about Copper, who needed another day of rest before being ridden hard. He thought about the way the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table where a boy was doing his sums. I can fix your fence, he said. He spent that day working the fence line on the east pasture, digging out rotted posts and setting new ones, stretching wire taut and driving staples with the methodical patience of a man who had done enough physical work in his life to find a kind of peace in it. Henry came out after his morning lessons and watched him for a while, and then began helping in the way that a 9-year-old helps, which is to say more with enthusiasm than efficiency. But Calvin managed it patiently and let the boy feel useful. "Did you know my papa?" Henry asked at one point, handing Calvin a staple. Calvin considered the most honest answer he could give. "I knew him a long time ago," he said, "before you were born. Were you friends?" "We were acquainted," Calvin said carefully. "People who know each other in business are not always friends." Henry accepted this with the seriousness with which he seemed to accept most things. "Mama says Papa made some mistakes before we came here. She does not tell me what they were. She says everyone makes mistakes and what matters is whether you try to do better." Calvin drove a staple home with 3 clean strokes and did not say anything for a moment. "Your mama is a wise woman," he said finally. "She is the smartest person I know," Henry said, with a simplicity and certainty that made Calvin smile before he could stop it. That evening, Mary made a supper of fried salt pork and fried potatoes and canned tomatoes, and she set a place for Calvin at the table without asking whether he was staying. He sat across from her, and beside Henry, and helped Ada with her fork when she dropped it, and it was the strangest and most ordinary evening he had spent in years. He could not remember the last time he had sat at a family table. He could not remember the last time the sound of a child's fork on a tin plate had seemed like anything worth noticing. After supper, when the children were in bed and the dishes were done, Mary and Calvin sat on the porch in the cool October evening. The sky over the Guadalupe Mountains was enormous and dusted thick with stars. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and then another answered, and the sound carried across the desert with its familiar lonesome music. "How long have you been on your own?" Mary asked. She was sitting in the other porch chair with a shawl around her shoulders and a cup of tea going cold in her hands. "Most of my adult life," Calvin said. "I had a place in Wyoming for a while, before the money went. After that I drifted. Cattle drives, fence work, sometime as a deputy in a town in Colorado that I do not think about fondly. I was not built for the law as it turned out." "Why not?" "Because the law is not always the same thing as what is right," he said, "and I have trouble pretending otherwise." She was quiet for a moment. "That is either a very moral position or a very convenient one," she said. He looked at her sidelong, and she was looking at the stars with a faint, dry quality to her expression that was definitely humor this time, and he laughed. It was a short sound, surprised out of him, and it felt strange in his chest, like a muscle he had not used in a while. "Fair enough," he said. They talked on the porch until the night was fully dark and cold, and when Calvin went back to the barn he lay on his bedroll and stared at the dark above him and tried to understand what was happening to him, and could not, so he closed his eyes and slept. He stayed 3 days to fix the fence, and when the fence was done, the roof of the hen house needed patching, and he did that too. Then a hinge on the barn door needed replacing, and the windmill required attention because its mechanical brake was sticking, which Calvin happened to know how to address because he had spent time once with a man who repaired windmills for a living. He was not in a hurry to leave, and he was honest enough with himself, in the quiet parts of the early mornings while he was tending copper, to admit that it was not only the work keeping him there. Mary Kingsley moved through her days with a kind of contained grace that he found himself watching when he thought she was not looking. She was efficient and unsentimental in her work, managing the household and the children and the practical demands of a small farm with a thoroughness that spoke to years of practice. But there were moments when Henry made her laugh with something unexpected, or when Ada fell asleep in her lap in the evening, or when she stood at the kitchen window in the late afternoon and looked out toward the mountains with something private and unreachable on her face, when the contained quality slipped just enough to show the person underneath all that competence, and that person was someone Calvin found himself wanting to know. On the 4th day, a man came to the farm. He arrived on a good horse, dressed well for Redemption Creek standards, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of someone who expected to get what he wanted. His name, Mary told Calvin quietly as the man tied his horse at the gate, was Douglas Hale. He was the largest landowner in the county, and he had been wanting to buy the Kingsley property for 2 years. Calvin hung back near the barn while Mary went to the gate. He was not hiding, but he was not announcing himself either. He watched. Douglas Hale was perhaps 45, heavy-set and red-faced, with the kind of manner that was friendly at the surface and not at all friendly underneath. He tipped his hat to Mary and spoke at length, and from the distance Calvin could not hear the words, but he could read the body language clearly enough. Hale was leaning against the gate post in a relaxed posture that was not relaxed, and Mary was standing with her arms crossed and her chin up in the position Calvin had come to recognize as her defended posture. After 10 minutes, Hale left without having come through the gate. Mary stood watching him ride away, and then she turned and walked back toward the house. She stopped when she saw Calvin watching from near the barn. "He wants to buy the property," she said. "He is very persistent about it." "I noticed," Calvin said. "Is it something you would consider?" "No," she said flatly. "This is my children's home. It is what their father left them. I will not sell it to Douglas Hale or anyone else." She said it with a finality that left no room for further discussion. "He has made 3 offers since Thomas died. They have gotten progressively less polite." Calvin looked at the road where Hale's dust was still settling. "Has he threatened you?" "Not in words," she said. "Men like Hale understand that words make witnesses." She shrugged, a small controlled movement. "He is a nuisance, not a danger. I have managed worse." Calvin was not sure he believed that fully, but he understood that Mary Kingsley was not a woman who accepted other people managing her difficulties on her behalf, so he said nothing more about it. That evening she asked him about Ruiz, not about the circumstances of his death, but about who he had been as a person. And Calvin, who had not spoken Ruiz's name to anyone in a long time, found himself talking about the man with a fullness that surprised him. He talked about the way Ruiz had laughed, which was loud and completely uninhibited in a way that seemed incongruous with how quietly he moved. He talked about the fact that Ruiz could cook anything out of almost nothing, that he had been planning to open a small restaurant someday, that he had taught Calvin to play cards properly and to lose without losing his temper, which Calvin had needed badly at the time. Mary listened to all of this with the quality of attention she brought to everything, not interrupting, not offering easy comfort, just listening with her whole self. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," she said when Calvin was done. "He was the best of us," Calvin said. "Out of all the men I knew in those years, he was the one who should have had the longest life. And Thomas's testimony," she said carefully, "is what sent him to prison." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. "I cannot apologize for what Thomas did. I can only tell you that I am sorry for what it cost you and for what it cost Ruiz's family." She looked at him directly. "I did not know the man I married as fully as I thought I did. That is something I have been sitting with since he died. There are things a person keeps hidden even from the person closest to them." "He gave you honest years," Calvin said. "Whatever he was before, he gave you that." "He did," she said, "and I am grateful for those years, and I am angry at him for the ones he carried in secret. Both things are true at the same time." Calvin nodded. "Both things can be true," he agreed. They looked at each other across the lamplight, and for a moment the kitchen was very quiet, and Calvin was very aware of the distance between them, which was small, and the distance between them, which was still significant and complicated and involved a dead man and 3 years of grief and anger and a widow's mourning dress. He stood up from the table. "I should go out and check on Copper," he said, which was not entirely false. Mary nodded, and he went, and the night air was cold and clear, and he stood in the barn for longer than Copper required and sorted out absolutely nothing. On the 5th day, Calvin rode into Redemption Creek to pick up supplies for Mary, flour and salt and lamp oil, and a spool of thread she needed. He tied Copper outside the general store and went in, and the storekeeper, A man named Peters, who had the particular quality of knowing everyone's business, greeted him with undisguised curiosity. "You are staying out at the Kingsley place," Peters said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Doing some repair work," Calvin said, giving his list across the counter. "That's so." Peters began pulling items. "How long you planning to stay?" "Long as the work needs," Calvin said, which was the honest answer and also left nothing open for commentary. Peters looked at him sidelong. "Douglas Hale been out there again. Once that I saw. Man wants that land bad," Peters said, lowering his voice confidentially. "He has been after it for 2 years. He needs the water rights that come with it. There is a spring on the east end of the Kingsley property, flows year-round. Hale's cattle need that water." He handed Calvin a wrapped parcel. "Mrs. Kingsley should be careful. Hale is not the kind of man who takes no for an answer forever." Calvin paid for the supplies and rode back to the farm thinking about springs and water rights and the particular kind of pressure that men like Douglas Hale knew how to apply to a woman alone with 2 children. He was not a lawman anymore and had not been one for years, and he was not a man who went looking for other people's fights. But he thought about Mary Kingsley standing at her gate with her chin up and her arms crossed, and he thought about Henry doing sums on a slate, and Ada feeding the chickens with such careful seriousness, and he thought that if Douglas Hale decided to become something more than a nuisance, there was a very real problem with no one close enough to address it. He told Mary what Peters had said about the spring. She already knew about the spring, of course. She listened to the rest of it with her characteristic stillness. "Peters is right that Hale does not accept no easily," she said, "but I have not given him reason to believe my answer will change." "He may not need a reason," Calvin said. "He may simply need enough time to decide he has been patient long enough." She looked at him carefully. "Are you suggesting you should stay?" He had not been consciously intending to suggest it, but hearing the question he understood that it was in fact what he had been moving toward. "I am suggesting that you should have someone around who can make the situation more complicated for Hale if it comes to that." "I have a rifle," she said. "I am aware," he said. "I have also seen it hanging unloaded on the wall." A pause. Then reluctantly, with a quality that was almost amusement, "Point taken." "I have no place in particular I need to be," Calvin said. "And there is work here that needs doing. The barn roof will need attention before winter. The garden wants a proper winterizing before the first hard frost. I can sleep in the barn and earn my keep, and if Hale decides to push things, at least you will not be managing it alone." Mary Kingsley looked out the kitchen window for a long time. The mountains in the distance were catching the last of the afternoon light, going from gold to pink to the deep purple that preceded dark. "You came here wanting something from my husband," she said finally, "and now you want to stay and help me." "Yes." "Why?" He thought about it. He thought about giving her a practical answer, and then he thought about giving her an honest one, and the honest one was closer to the surface than he expected. "Because I came here carrying 3 years of anger," he said, "and I walked through that gate and it went somewhere I did not expect, and I find that I want to stay. Not out of obligation to a dead man, not out of guilt, because this place and the people in it are worth staying for." He had not entirely meant to say that. He watched her face for the response, and what he saw there was complex, wariness and something else underneath the wariness, something that might have been the beginning of something she was not yet ready to name. 6 weeks, she said, through the first frost. Help me winterize the place and deal with Hale if he becomes a problem. After that we will see where things stand. 6 weeks, Calvin agreed. He did not think 6 weeks was going to be enough, but he did not say so. He settled into a routine with the discipline that had always been his strongest characteristic. Up before dawn to tend the horses, then whatever major work the day called for: roof patching, wood splitting, repairing the vegetable garden's wire enclosure, clearing the irrigation channel from the spring that served the kitchen garden. After dinner he helped Henry with the more difficult sums, and the reading that the boys' previous schooling had not quite managed, because the nearest school was 4 miles away, and Mary drove him in the wagon twice a week, but could not manage it every day. In the evenings, he and Mary sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and talked. The talking was what he looked forward to most, which was not something he would have predicted about himself. Calvin Garrett had not been a man who talked much in the years before Redemption Creek. He had been self-contained to the point of solitude, more comfortable with horses than people, and more comfortable with silence than conversation. But Mary Kingsley did not make conversation easy by being easy herself. She challenged things, pressed on assumptions, offered her own positions clearly, and then listened with equal clarity to his response. She had read more books than almost anyone he had met in the territories, borrowing from a lending library in town and trading with a schoolteacher in the next county. She had opinions about things that mattered, and she was not afraid to hold them out where they could be examined. She had come to Redemption Creek from Missouri, she told him, in the second week of his staying. She had met Thomas Kingsley at a church social when she was 22 and he was 30, and she had thought him charming and capable and settled. And she had been right about capable and settled, at least in part, and she had learned the rest slowly over the years that followed. They had married and come west because Thomas had wanted land of his own, and they had built this place together with their hands, and then Thomas had gotten sick in September and been dead by October. "Were you happy?" Calvin asked once, and immediately thought the question was too forward for where they were, but Mary answered it without visible discomfort. "Sometimes," she said. "There were good years. There were years that were harder. I think we were better at building things together than we were at talking to each other." She paused. "I do not think either of us knew when we married what the other person truly was. We became fond of each other through the work. That is not nothing." "No," Calvin agreed, "it is not nothing. Is there someone waiting for you?" she asked. "In Texas or anywhere else?" "No," he said simply. She nodded, and they sat quietly for a while, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, which was the most telling kind. Douglas Hale came back 10 days after Calvin's arrival at the farm. He came this time with a man beside him, a large, flat-faced man who was introduced as his foreman, but who had the look of someone whose employment involved more than fence lines. Calvin was working on the barn roof when he heard them coming and climbed down. He was at the gate before Mary reached it, not in front of her but beside her, and he did not say anything, just stood there and watched Hale take in the fact that there was now a man on the property. Hale recovered quickly. He tipped his hat to Mary and smiled with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned to use his face. "Mrs. Kingsley," he said, "I heard you had someone helping out. That is fine. A place this size needs a hand." "It is coming along well," Mary said. "What can I do for you, Mr. Hale?" "I wanted to renew my offer on the property," Hale said. "I have had my surveyor out to estimate value, and I believe I can offer you something very fair. Something that would let you and your children move somewhere more comfortable, somewhere without the burden of all this work." "I appreciate your interest," Mary said, "but I am not interested in selling." Hale's eyes moved to Calvin. "And you are Calvin Garrett," Calvin said. He did not offer his hand, and he did not elaborate. "Are you a relation of Mrs. Kingsley's?" "I am a friend," Calvin said. Hale assessed this. His expression remained pleasantly neutral, but his foreman had rested his hand on his belt in a way that was not quite casual. "Well," Hale said, "I hope you will encourage Mrs. Kingsley to think carefully about her situation. A woman alone with children in winter, it is a difficult thing. My offer is generous." "She knows her own mind," Calvin said. Hale smiled, and it did not reach his eyes. "Of course she does. I will leave you both to your day. Mrs. Kingsley, you know where to find me when you change your mind." He tipped his hat again and rode away with his foreman, and Calvin watched them go and felt the quiet, steady settling of someone who has identified a problem and is making a plan. "He is going to keep coming," Mary said beside him. "Yes," Calvin said, "but it is going to get harder for him to do anything about it. Because of you." "Because of us," he said, and glanced at her, and she held his gaze for a moment before looking back at the road. That evening, Henry announced at dinner that he wanted to learn to ride properly. He could ride the bay well enough for the farm, but he wanted to learn what Calvin knew, and he said so with such earnest directness that Calvin looked at Mary over the boy's head and raised an eyebrow, and she made the small, resigned gesture of a mother who knows when she has already lost a battle. After chores, Calvin said. Every day, Henry asked. Every day that weather allows, Calvin said. Henry nodded with the gravity of someone entering into a serious contract, and Ada, who had been listening, announced that she also wanted to ride, and the resulting negotiation about Ada's age and the size of the gray mare occupied the rest of dinner in a way that made the kitchen warm and full of sound, and Calvin ate his supper in the middle of all of it and felt something settle in him that he did not yet have a name for. He taught Henry to ride in the evenings, starting with the basics and working forward with patience, correcting seat and hands and the quality of communication between a rider and a horse. Henry was a natural, with his mother's focus and a physical fearlessness that was entirely his own. The boy took corrections without ego and practiced what he was taught without being told twice, and within 2 weeks, he was handling the gray mare on the open ground east of the barn with a confidence that Calvin found genuinely impressive. Ada, as promised, got her own lessons on a lead line, and she sat on the gray mare's broad back with the same concentrated seriousness she brought to feeding chickens, and declared after her 3rd lesson that she was going to race at the county fair. "When you are older," Mary told her. "How much older?" Ada demanded. "Older than 5, Mary said. Ada considered this. "What about 6? We will discuss it when you are 6, Mary said. Ada turned to Calvin with the particular appeal of a child who suspects one adult can be leveraged against another. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "what do you think?" "I think your mama is right," Calvin said, without hesitation. Ada looked at him with narrowed eyes that suggested this was not the answer she had expected, and that he had lost significant standing in her estimation. Then she turned back to her supper with philosophical acceptance. Mary caught Calvin's eye across the table and the corner of her mouth lifted, and he felt the warmth of it in his chest like sunlight. 3 weeks into his stay, Calvin drove Mary into town for supplies, and the trip took most of a morning and gave them the particular freedom of conversation that comes from being side by side on a wagon seat with nowhere to go but forward. Mary asked him about Wyoming, about what his life had been before Laramie, and he told her about growing up in Ohio and making his way west at 17 with $2 and a borrowed horse, and an absolute certainty that he was going to make something of his life that he had not yet figured out. He had made some of it, he supposed. He had been honest in his dealings and hard-working in his labor and faithful to the people he cared about. He had also ended up at 31 without land or family or anything he might call a home, chasing a dead man across 300 miles of desert on a grievance that had turned out to be a ghost. "You are not what I expected," Mary told him as they passed the outskirts of town. "What did you expect?" She thought about it. "Someone harder," she said. "Someone more finished. A man with your history, tracking a grievance for 3 years. I expected someone with all the soft parts worn away." She looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "You have not lost the soft parts, Calvin." It was the first time she had used his given name, and he noticed it, and from the slight pause that followed it he thought she noticed it too. "I have tried to keep them," he said. "It has not always been convenient." She laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that was different from the dry, controlled humor she usually allowed herself, and it lit her face in a way that made something in Calvin's chest do something complicated and undeniable. He was in love with her. He understood it in that moment with the clarity of something that had been arriving gradually and was now simply there, complete and without apology. He was in love with Mary Kingsley, widow, mother, and manager of a homestead in the high desert of New Mexico Territory, who had stopped him cold at her gate 9 days before he ever expected to feel anything at all. He did not say this. It was too soon, and the situation was too complicated, and she was still in mourning, and the last thing he wanted was to crowd her with something she was not ready to receive. So he looked at the road ahead and let the warmth of her laugh settle in him like something stored against a cold season. In Redemption Creek, while Mary was at the dry goods store, Calvin had a conversation with the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Birch who had the measured manner of someone who had been doing a difficult job for a long time without enough resources. Calvin mentioned Hale's repeated visits and the unspoken quality of the pressure he was applying. "I know about Hale and that spring," Birch said. He was leaning against the post of his office and looking at Calvin with the assessment of a man who weighed strangers carefully. "He has been after that water for 2 years. The law is clear enough on the water rights. They belong to the property owner, and Mrs. Kingsley owns the property. As long as she does not sell, he has no claim. And if he decides to create a situation that makes it harder for her to hold on," Calvin said, "that would be a matter for the law," Birch said. "If you can give me something to work with." He looked at Calvin steadily. "You planning to stay around?" "For now," Calvin said. "Good," Birch said. "She is a good woman. She should not have to manage Hale alone." He pushed off the post. "You let me know if Hale steps over a line I can act on." Calvin returned to Mary at the dry goods store and helped load the wagon, and they drove back through the afternoon sun. And Mary told him about the schoolteacher she had spoken with near the store, who had offered to take Henry for additional lessons twice a week, which was a better arrangement than the current one and which Mary was considering seriously. "It would mean some extra driving," she said. "But Henry needs more than I can give him. He is quick. He deserves a proper education." "He is very quick," Calvin agreed. "Smarter than most adults I have met." "He gets that from me," Mary said, with a perfect straight face, and Calvin laughed, and the sound of it surprised him again the way it had the first time, like something returning that had been away for too long. The first hard frost came in the 4th week, which was earlier than expected, and Calvin spent 2 full days before it arrived cutting and stacking wood with Henry's help, while Mary wrapped the remaining garden plants and brought in the last of the squash and covered the tender herbs in the kitchen garden with burlap. They worked in a coordinated effort that felt as natural as if it had always been this way, moving around each other in the kitchen, and the yard with an ease that both of them were aware of and neither of them remarked on. The night of the frost, with the temperature dropping sharp and the stars brilliant and hard overhead, Calvin came in from the barn to find Mary standing at the kitchen window with a cup of tea, looking out at the dark. "Ada has a small cough," she said when he came in. "Nothing serious yet. But I am watching it. Do you have the herbs for it?" he asked. "I do. I made a tea with honey and dried thyme." She looked at him. "You know medicine plants?" "A little. My mother was from a family that knew them. She taught me some of it." He hung his coat and hat on the peg by the door. "I can sit with Ada tonight if she needs someone, let you sleep." Mary looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "You would do that?" "Yes." "Why?" she asked, not challenging him, genuinely asking. He thought about how to say it. "Because she is a child who is not feeling well," he said, "and someone should be with her." "You are not her father," Mary said. There was nothing unkind in it. She was simply placing the fact between them carefully. "I know," he said. "I am not trying to be anything I am not. I am just a man who is here, and there is a child who might need someone, and I have 2 hands and I am willing to use them." He looked at her steadily. "That is all I am offering, Mary." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "She would probably sleep better with me there anyway, but thank you." "Of course," he said. He went to the barn, and he lay on his bedroll, and he stared at the dark and listened to the cold wind move around the corners of the building. And he thought about what he was doing and whether it was wise. And he decided that wisdom was a fine thing, but it was not the only thing. Ada's cough was better by morning, and she was asking for breakfast with her usual determined energy before Mary had the stove properly lit, which Mary said was a reliable sign of recovery. Hale came back the following week with his foreman and a third man, a lawyer from Las Cruces who had traveled 3 days to present what Hale described as a formal offer for the property. They arrived mid-morning and requested a meeting at the kitchen table, and Mary allowed it, and Calvin stood in the kitchen doorway and did not sit down. The lawyer produced papers and spoke at length about the generous terms and the various difficulties of maintaining a property of this size and the various benefits of the capital that would result from a sale. The number he quoted was real money, Calvin had to admit, but he watched Mary's face through all of it, and her face did not change. "I will tell you the same thing I have told Mr. Hale 3 times, she said, when the lawyer had finished. "This property is not for sale. Not at this price. Not at any price." She looked at the lawyer directly. "I understand that you have traveled a long way to be told no, and I am sorry for the inconvenience of that, but the answer will not change." The lawyer looked at Hale. Hale looked at Calvin. His expression was carefully pleasant. "Perhaps Mr. Garrett," he said, "as a friend of the family, might offer some counsel on this." "Mrs. Kingsley does not need counsel from me," Calvin said. "She has made herself clear." Hale's pleasant expression held for another moment, and then he folded up the edges of it and put it away. "I see," he said. He stood and nodded to the lawyer. "We will see ourselves out." At the door he turned back. "Mrs. Kingsley, I hope you will reconsider, for your children's sake." "My children's sake," Mary said calmly, "is exactly why I am keeping this land." Hale left and the lawyer followed, and when the sound of horses faded down the road, Calvin turned to Mary and she let out a long, controlled breath that told him she had been holding it through the whole conversation. "He is running out of polite options," Calvin said. "I know," she said. "What comes after polite? For a man like Hale, probably something with the bank. He will look for any loan or debt he can use as leverage." He thought about it. "What is the state of the property's debts?" "There is a small mortgage from the bank in Las Cruces," she said. "Thomas took it 3 years ago to build the barn. The payments are current. I have never missed one." She looked at Calvin steadily. "I have enough set aside to maintain the payments through spring." "Then keep them current and give him no opening there," Calvin said. "And if anything changes, anything at all, we go to Birch first thing." She looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite what she had shown him before. "We," she said. The word sat between them. "Yes," Calvin said. "We." Something shifted in her expression. It was careful and tentative, but it was there, and he recognized it because he had been carrying something similar for weeks. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and talked for a long time, and eventually the conversation found its way into territory that neither of them had navigated directly before. Mary spoke about loneliness, not as a complaint but as a plain description of reality, the loneliness of managing everything alone, of having no one to share a concern with at the end of the day, of going to sleep in a house that was full of people and waking up still somehow solitary. "It is the particular loneliness of being responsible for everything," she said. "When you have children, you cannot fall apart. You cannot have a bad day that affects them. You manage it and you carry it, and at some point you look up and realize that you have been managing and carrying for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to put it down." "Put it down," Calvin said quietly. She looked at him. "Put it down," he said. "Not forever, not irresponsibly, just for a moment. I am here. You do not have to carry all of it tonight." She looked at him with those direct brown eyes, and he saw in them the full complexity of what she was, strong and tired and grieving and resilient and lonely and cautious and hopeful in a way she was not quite ready to admit to. "Calvin," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think I may be very glad you came through that gate," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, very gently, just the warmth of it, not demanding anything, not pressing forward. She looked at his hand on hers, and then she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. And they sat like that in the lamplight while the night moved through its dark hours outside the window. And it was the most honest and careful and real thing Calvin Garrett had felt in longer than he could clearly remember. After a while she pulled her hand back gently and said that she should sleep, and he said good night. And she went to her room, and he went to the barn, and he lay on his bedroll and felt the warmth of her hand in his like a coal he was keeping carefully fed. The weeks that followed were the best of Calvin's adult life, and he was aware of that fact with the particular vividness of a man who has spent a long time without anything good and therefore recognizes it when it arrives. He and Mary fell into each other's company with a naturalness that neither of them pushed or forced. It was simply there, the way that certain things are there when the conditions are right, growing without being planted. They took to riding together in the late afternoons when the work permitted it, Mary on the bay and Calvin on Copper, out into the open country east of the farm where the land stretched wide and the light went long and golden, and the mountains made their blue distance in every direction. They talked on those rides in a way that was different from the kitchen table conversations, looser and more wide-ranging, because something about the open country made it easier to say things that were harder to say inside. He told her about Ohio and his father, who had been a good man with a difficult disposition, and his mother, who had kept the family together with a stubbornness that Calvin recognized now as the source of whatever stubbornness he himself possessed. He told her about the years of drifting and why he had never managed to stop somewhere long enough to make a life, and she listened and then offered her own reading of it, which was that he had been waiting for somewhere worth stopping. "Is that what I was doing?" he said. "I think so," she said. "Men like you do not drift because they are restless. They drift because they have not found what they are looking for." "What about women like you?" he said. "Women like me," she said, "do not have the option of drifting. We stand still and manage things and wait for circumstances to change." She was quiet for a moment. "Though I think there are different ways of searching, drifting is one. Staying put and looking carefully at everything that comes through your gate is another." He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the mountains and the afternoon sky, and there was a small curve at the corner of her mouth. "Is that what you were doing?" he said. "When I rode up, I was standing at my gate in mourning with 2 children and a mortgage and a man who wanted my spring," she said. "I was doing whatever was necessary." She glanced at him. "But yes, I was also looking carefully." He did not say the things he wanted to say right then, because the timing still felt important to him. She was 7 weeks out from Thomas's death. The mourning was real and he respected it. He could wait, but Henry, who had apparently inherited his mother's directness along with her intelligence, was not as patient. One morning in December, while Calvin was teaching him to check the hooves of the bay for stones, Henry looked up and said without preamble, "Are you going to court my mother?" Calvin looked at him. Henry looked back with perfect seriousness. "Why do you ask?" Calvin said. "Because you look at her the way I have seen men look at women who they want to court," Henry said. "And because she laughs more than she used to." He paused. "I think it would be good if you did. She deserves to be happy, and so do you." Calvin set down the bay's hoof and straightened up and looked at Henry for a long moment. "You are a remarkable 9-year-old," he said. "I am going to be 10 in February," Henry said. "What is your answer?" "My answer," Calvin said carefully, "is that your mother's feelings on the matter are the important ones, and she is the one I would need to speak to." "I know," Henry said. "I am asking you first so I can prepare." He picked up the hoof pick and handed it to Calvin with the gravity of someone who had arranged affairs to his satisfaction. "I think she would say yes." Calvin went back to the hoof and did not say anything, and his face felt warm in a way that the December air could not entirely account for. Hale made his move in the second week of December. It came not through the bank, as Calvin had anticipated, but through a different mechanism. One of the property's fence lines on the north edge had a disputed survey point, an old marking that Hale claimed put 3 acres of what Mary believed was her land within the boundary of his own property. He filed a claim at the land office in Las Cruces, and the result was a notice delivered to Mary's door by a county deputy, informing her that there was a formal survey dispute pending, and that the land in question was subject to a temporary order limiting her use of it. Mary read the notice at the kitchen table with Calvin across from her, and when she put it down her face was carefully controlled in a way that he had come to understand as very serious anger. "That land has our wood lot on it," she said. "Half the winter's fuel is from those 3 acres. Can he make the claim stick?" Calvin asked. "I do not know. The original survey was done 10 years ago before we bought the land." The survey points may be unclear enough that he can argue the boundary. She stood up. I need to get to Las Cruces and talk to someone who understands land law. I will take you, Calvin said immediately. She looked at him with the assessing quality she always brought to offers of help. It is a 2-day ride. I know. The children cannot be left alone. Can Peters's wife watch them? Calvin suggested. She mentioned last week that Ada and her granddaughter play together. Mary thought about it. She did say that. Then ask her. We go to Las Cruces, we find a lawyer who knows land disputes, and we deal with this properly. She arranged it with Peters's wife, who agreed readily, and they rode for Las Cruces the following morning in the wagon with Copper tied behind, setting off in the cold early hours before the children were awake. The road south was long and dusty, and the desert around it was winter-bare and beautiful in the pale morning light, with the distant mountains going from charcoal to lavender as the sun came up. They talked the whole way, which was the nature of a long wagon ride with someone you were comfortable with, the conversation moving through every subject without agenda, the land claim and what to do about it, and then Henry's education and the schoolteacher's offer, and then a book Mary was reading that she had borrowed from the lending library, and then a story Calvin told her about a cattle drive years ago that had gone wrong in a way that was in retrospect funny, but had not been funny at the time. And she laughed in the open air of the desert road, and he felt it the same way he always felt her laughter. They stayed at a respectable inn in Las Cruces, separate rooms, and in the morning Calvin went with Mary to the office of a land attorney named Welch who had a reputation in the territory for knowing survey law. Welch looked at Mary's deeds and the original survey documents and the notice from the county, and he was not encouraging, but he was not discouraging either. The original survey does have an ambiguity, he said, but there is a way to challenge it. You need a resurvey by a licensed territorial surveyor, done properly with witnesses. If the resurvey supports your boundary, Hale's claim fails. He looked at Mary over his spectacles. I can file the challenge and arrange the surveyor. It will take time and it will not be cheap. How much time and how much not cheap? Mary asked directly. He named figures. Mary looked at Calvin briefly, and Calvin gave a small nod, and she turned back to Welch. Do it, she said. File the challenge. On the road home that evening, they made camp near a creek that still had enough water to supply them and the horses, and Calvin built a fire and Mary made coffee from the supplies they had brought, and they sat beside the fire in the winter dark of the New Mexico desert, and the fire made light, and the sky above was enormous. I have money, Calvin said. Not a great deal, but enough to cover Welch's fees if it comes to that. Mary looked at him across the fire. I cannot take your money. You can, he said. I have no particular use for it. I have been carrying it around for 3 years waiting to make something useful of it. He looked at the fire. Let me do something useful. She was quiet for a while. The fire snapped and settled. One of the horses shifted in the dark behind them. If I accept help from you in a matter of money, she said carefully, it changes things between us. It changes things between us if I offer it and you refuse, he said. It is already changed. She looked at him. He looked back. Calvin, she said. Mary, he said. And then, because the night was quiet and the fire was warm and they had been moving toward this for weeks, she said, I think I am falling in love with you, and I think that is very inconvenient. Very inconvenient, he agreed, with a warmth in his voice he did not try to conceal. I am only 9 weeks a widow, she said. My husband is barely cold in the ground. Whatever I feel, and I am not fully certain of what I feel, the timing is very bad. The timing is terrible, he said. I agree completely. He looked at her across the fire. I am in love with you. I have been for a while. I am not telling you that to press you toward anything. I am telling you because I think you should know the truth of what is between us so you can make whatever decision is right for you with your eyes open. She was quiet for a long time. The fire burned down a little. The desert was full of its nighttime sounds, small and distant and old. I am not ready, she said finally. Not yet. There are things I need to work through. There is grief that is still present. There is also the fact that I do not fully know whether the man I grieved was the man I thought he was, and that is a particular and complicated grief. She looked at him steadily. But I do not want you to leave. I am not going anywhere, he said. I need time, she said. I have time, he said. All of it you need. She reached across the space between them, and he took her hand, and they sat that way beside the fire until the cold drove them to their bedrolls. And when they rode home in the morning, the world was clear and sharp, and the mountains were very beautiful. January came in cold and quiet, and Calvin Garrett spent it working the farm and teaching Henry to ride and helping Ada with the letters that her mother was teaching her, and sitting in the evenings with Mary in the lamplight of the kitchen. They were careful with each other, and they were close with each other, and both things were true at the same time. The resurvey happened in the third week of January, conducted by a licensed territorial surveyor named Fuentes who had 30 years of experience and a precise and uncompromising manner. He spent 2 days on the north boundary with his instruments, and his conclusion was clear. The original survey had been set imprecisely, but when corrected for the established landmark points, the Kingsley property boundary was precisely where Mary claimed it was. Hale's 3 acres were not his. Welch filed the findings, and the county judge ruled in Mary's favor before the end of the month. Hale had no legal ground left on which to stand, and Calvin watched from the yard when the deputy came to deliver the ruling, and Mary read it on the porch with Henry beside her. And when Henry said, "We won, Mama," Mary closed her eyes for just a moment, and her whole face went through something private and complete. Hale did not come again after that. Calvin heard in town a month later that the man had purchased water rights from a property in the next county and had turned his attention elsewhere. It was the way of men like Hale. When the easy options were gone, they found a different easy option rather than a harder fight. Calvin was glad it had resolved cleanly and without anything that required the revolver on his hip, which he had not needed once in Redemption Creek, and which he had begun to think about moving to the bottom of his saddlebag. Henry turned 10 in February, and Mary made a cake with dried fruit and nuts that she had been saving since fall, and Calvin found in the dry goods store in town a small compass in a brass case that the storekeeper's wife had ordered for her own son, and then been left with after the son received 2 as gifts. It was a fine thing, made well, with a lid that closed over the face. Henry held it as though it were something from another world and looked at Calvin with an expression that Calvin was not going to forget. "For navigation," Calvin told him, "so you always know which way you are going." Henry nodded very seriously. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett," he said. "Calvin," Calvin said. "You can call me Calvin." Henry looked at his mother, who gave a small nod. He looked back at Calvin. "Thank you, Calvin," he said, with a gravity that made the name feel like something formal and considered, which he supposed it was. In March, when the weather was beginning to ease and the first tentative green was returning to the high desert country and the days were longer and the light was warmer, Mary came to the barn one morning while Calvin was tending copper, and she stood in the barn doorway with the early light behind her and said, "I have been thinking." He turned from copper to face her. About us," she said. "About what I said in January, about needing time." He waited. "I have had time," she said. "And I have thought clearly, and I have let myself grieve properly, and I have sorted out what I feel about Thomas, and what I feel about this farm, and what I feel about my life going forward." She came into the barn, and she was not carrying the particular controlled tension she sometimes carried, the armor of a woman who had been managing alone for a very long time. She looked lighter somehow, more present. "And what I feel," she said, "when I have set all the other things aside and looked at the honest truth of it, is that I love you, Calvin Garrett. And I have been in love with you since somewhere around the time you sat in my kitchen and told me about Ruiz with complete honesty and then went and checked on your horse before yourself." He looked at her for a moment with everything he felt rising in him, warm and clear and absolutely certain. "Mary," he said. "Do not just say my name," she said. "Tell me something." "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since you stopped me cold at your gate before I even reached the door, and I intend to go on loving you for as long as you will allow it." She crossed the distance between them, and he took her face in his hands, and she put her hands over his. And he kissed her there in the barn in the March morning light, with Copper watching with equine indifference, and the spring air coming through the open door. And it was not a dramatic kiss so much as a true one, the kind that feels like arriving somewhere you did not know you were headed. When they pulled back, she was smiling in a way he had not seen from her before, unguarded and full, and he thought it was the best thing he had ever seen. "What do we do now?" she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said, "but not today because I want to do it properly and not in a barn." She laughed, and he felt it the same way he always felt her laughter, like something stored against the cold. He did it properly. He found a morning in the second week of March when Henry and Ada were both occupied with lessons, and he and Mary were alone in the kitchen. And he told her clearly, and with full honesty, what he wanted, which was to marry her and make his life beside her, and help her raise her children and build whatever came next from this place and this moment. He did not have a ring yet, but he told her he intended to rectify that, and she told him that the ring was not the point, and he said he knew, but the point was he wanted to do it right. And she said she would take him to the silversmith in Las Cruces because there was a woman there who made beautiful rings, and she had always thought them lovely. Henry took the news with the satisfaction of someone whose arrangements had come out as intended. He nodded when Mary told him, with the gravity of a 10-year-old who has decided things and watched them unfold correctly, and said, "Good." Then he went back to his lessons. Ada, who had fewer filters than her brother, burst into a wide smile and said, "So Calvin is going to be our papa now." Mary looked at Calvin, and Calvin looked at Ada and said carefully, "I am going to be your stepfather, which is a kind of papa. It is a little different from what you had before, and that is all right." Ada considered this. "Can you still teach me to ride faster?" "Yes," Calvin said. "Then that is good," Ada declared, and went back to her meal with complete philosophical satisfaction. They were married in April, in the small church in Redemption Creek, with Sheriff Birch as a witness and Peters and his wife and the school teacher, and a handful of other people who had come to know Mary in the years she had lived there. Henry stood very straight beside his mother, and Ada wore a ribbon in her hair that she had insisted on, and then spent the entire ceremony trying to straighten, which Mary finally solved by quietly taking Ada's hands and holding them. Calvin wore a clean suit that he had purchased in Las Cruces for the occasion, and when he looked at Mary in the church light in the blue dress she had made from fabric she had been saving, he felt the weight of every mile he had ridden to reach this place, and he was grateful for every one of them, even the hard ones, because they had all led him here. The silversmith in Las Cruces had made a ring of silver with a small turquoise stone set in it, and when Calvin placed it on Mary's finger in the ceremony it caught the light, and she looked at it, and then at him with everything present in her face, the grief and the hope and the love, and the particular strength of a woman who has come through a great deal and arrived somewhere good. They said their vows in the plain language of the territory, and Calvin meant every word of his with every part of himself. And when the ceremony was done they rode back to the farm together, the four of them, Henry and Ada in the bed of the wagon with their good clothes already accumulating dust, and the spring afternoon warm and bright around them, and Copper tied behind with the particular contentment of a horse who knows he is going home. The summer that followed was the best season Calvin Garrett had spent in his life. He worked the farm with a wholeness of commitment that he had never before given to anything, because it was his now, not by law, though the deed was being amended, and he had contributed substantially to the mortgage, but by love and intention and daily labor. He planted summer vegetables beside Mary's kitchen garden plot, and the two plots ran together in a confusion of squash and beans, and tomatoes that was more productive than either had been separately. He built a proper shelter for the chickens that was predator-proof, and Ada inspected it with professional seriousness and declared it satisfactory. He and Henry worked the pasture fence together with a companionship that had evolved naturally from teacher and student into something more mutual and fond. And when the fence was done, Henry said, with perfect simplicity, "It looks good," and Calvin said, "It does." And they both looked at what they had built and were satisfied. Mary was different in the summer, or perhaps he was seeing her differently now that there was no longer the careful, measured space between them. She was still efficient and unsentimental and direct, all the things she had always been, but there was a quality of ease in her that had not been there in the fall, as though some weight had been distributed more evenly. She laughed more, not at more things necessarily, but more fully, with less guard on the sound of it. She came and found him sometimes in the middle of the day for no reason other than to say a thing she had thought of, or to stand beside him for a moment before returning to her work, and he loved those moments with a simple and unambiguous devotion. In the evenings they sat on the porch after the children were in bed and talked or were quiet, and both were equally good. The desert summer nights were warm, and the stars were the kind that only existed in sky this far from the cities and this high in elevation, and they would sit until the night was old and neither of them felt any urgency about ending it. He wrote a letter to Ruiz's widow in Laramie. He had been sending money when he could for years, but this letter was different. He told her about what had happened and where he had ended up, and he told her that Ruiz had been remembered and honored, and that he thought about him. He told her the name of the woman he had married and where they lived, and that she and her daughters were welcome to come visit if they ever found themselves in New Mexico territory, which was unlikely, but which he offered with complete sincerity. He received a letter back 2 months later that was short and careful, and then unexpectedly warm at the end. The widow said she was glad he had found something good. She said that was what Ruiz would have wanted for him. She said she thought of Ruiz every day and that she was managing, that her girls were growing up well. The letter made Calvin sit very still at the kitchen table for a while, and when Mary came in and saw his face, she sat across from him and said, "Tell me," and he did. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he held it, and after a while he was able to say that it was all right, that he was all right, and she said, "I know," and they sat like that until the supper needed tending and they both went to it together. In the fall, a year after Calvin had first ridden into Redemption Creek, Mary told him one morning in the kitchen, quietly, with her characteristic directness, that she was expecting a child. She watched his face when she said it, and what she saw there was joy so immediate and uncomplicated that she laughed at the sight of it. He came around the table and took her hands and held them and said, "When?" "Spring," she said, "somewhere around April." "Last year in April I barely knew you," he said. "This year in April we will have a child." "A great deal can happen in a year," she said, with the dry quality that he loved completely. He pulled her to him and held her, and she let him, which still felt like a gift every time. Henry, when told, responded with the particular practicality of a boy who was going to be 11 in February. He said, "Is it going to be a boy or a girl?" And when Mary said they did not know yet, he thought about it and said, "I think a boy would be useful." Ada said she wanted a girl and that she had already decided the name should be Rose, and when told that the decision was not entirely hers, she received the information philosophically and said that Rose was a very good suggestion that the adults should strongly consider. The winter was cold and the farm was warm, and Calvin found that he did not miss the drifting life at all, not even on the days when the work was hard and the weather closed in, and there was nothing but the same small space of house and barn and pasture. He had never understood before what it meant to be somewhere you wanted to be. He had always been moving towards something or away from something. The stillness of staying, the accumulated depth of days in the same place with the same people, was something he was still learning, and it was the best learning of his life. He taught Ada to read that winter, sitting with her in the evenings while Mary worked on mending and Henry did his lessons, going through letters and sounds with a patience that surprised him because he had not known he possessed it. Ada was a quick student when she decided to apply herself and a spectacular avoider of effort when she did not, and Calvin learned to distinguish between the two states and address each appropriately. By February, she was reading simple sentences on her own, and she held up the reader and pointed at the words and read aloud with a fierce pride that made both Calvin and Mary stop what they were doing to listen. Henry turned 11, and Calvin gave him a proper saddle, second-hand but in good condition, that he had found in Las Cruces and refurbished over the winter in the barn. Henry ran his hands over the leather and looked at Calvin with a fullness in his expression that he did not quite have words for at 11, but Calvin understood it. "Thank you," Henry said, and meant a great deal more than the saddle. "You are welcome," Calvin said, and meant a great deal more than the giving. The spring baby came in the last week of April, earlier than expected but not dangerously so, in the room that Calvin and Mary shared with the midwife from town in attendance, and Calvin in the hall outside the door, which was where the midwife had firmly directed him, and where he stood for 3 hours listening to Mary's labor with a helplessness that was entirely new to his experience, and that he handled by walking the length of the hall approximately 40 times. The baby was a boy. He came into the world with a considerable opinion about the experience, which he expressed at length, and the midwife brought him out to Calvin in the hall and placed him in Calvin's arms, and Calvin stood in the hall of his house in the April morning light with his son in his arms, and whatever he had come here looking for 3 years ago was so thoroughly irrelevant to this moment that it might have belonged to another man's life. They named him James, for Calvin's father, who had been a difficult man but a good one, and they gave him the middle name of Thomas, which was Mary's idea, and which Calvin accepted without question because it was the right thing to do. James Calvin Garrett was a month old when Calvin wrote to Ruiz's widow again, telling her about the baby and enclosing a photograph that a traveling photographer had made, because photography was something that existed now in this late decade of the century, and Calvin thought that a photograph of a child was something worth having and worth sharing. He told the widow that James had been given the middle name of Thomas, in honor of someone who had tried to do better at the end, and he hoped that was something she could receive with the spirit it was intended. He did not know if it was right or wrong, or if there was a clean accounting to be made of men's actions and debts and the things that came after. He knew only that the people he loved were here in this house and on this land, and that he was here with them, and that it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the way that only the most surprising things can be, exactly what his life had always been pointing toward without his knowledge. James grew with the particular energy of a child who has been given a great deal of space to be in, and he was a solid and curious and fearless baby who pulled himself to standing ahead of schedule and walked at 10 months, which Ada told him was very impressive. And Henry, who was 12 by then and genuinely useful on the farm, taught his little brother about horses the way Calvin had taught him, with patience and care, and the passing on of knowledge between people who love each other. Ada did get her girl cousin eventually, as it turned out, when the Fuentes family, the same surveyor Fuentes who had resolved the land dispute, who had a daughter Ada's age, began coming to Sunday dinners, and the two girls formed a friendship of the thorough and permanent variety that made itself felt in loud and energetic terms every Sunday afternoon. Mary managed this with the equanimity she brought to most things, and Calvin managed the horses that the Fuentes family brought and stood with Mr. Fuentes on the porch and talked about land and water and the changing territory, and found that life in Redemption Creek had accumulated, quietly, a whole world of people and connections and small histories. 2 years after James was born, Mary told Calvin one October morning, 5 years now from the fall when he had ridden into town with a grudge and a revolver and found something else entirely, that she was expecting again. This time she told him at the kitchen table with her coffee, matter of fact, watching his face with a small smile that was already there before she even finished the sentence because she knew what she was going to see there. She was right. He was exactly as immediate about it the second time. Spring again, he said. March this time, she said. Earlier. March, he said. He reached across the table for her hand. A spring baby and a March baby. Ada wants another Rose, Mary said dryly. She has not given up on the name. Ada is 9, Calvin said. She has strong opinions. She gets that from someone, Mary said and looked at him. From her mother, Calvin said. From both sides, Mary said. And she was smiling fully now, the unguarded smile that she had given him first in the barn that March morning when everything had become clear between them, and he loved it exactly as much as he had the first time. The second baby came in March, in the way that things come when they are ready, and it was a girl. She came in with the particular determined quality that the Garrett children seemed to share, and she had Mary's brown eyes and Calvin's stubborn jaw and Ada's delight in the world from the very first week. Rose, Ada said, with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting a long time for something and has finally received it. Rose, Mary agreed, with a look at Calvin that contained everything. Rose it is, Calvin said. He stood in the kitchen of the house he had helped build and watched his family in the morning light, Mary at the stove, Henry at the table with his schoolwork, James on the floor building something elaborate out of spools and sticks, Ada in the corner with the baby carefully in her arms because she had been deemed old enough and responsible enough to hold her sister, and little Rose with her eyes open and taking in the world with the focused intensity of someone who intends to understand it. Calvin Garrett had ridden into Redemption Creek in the autumn of 1878 with 3 years of anger and a loaded revolver, and a name in his mouth that he had meant as an accusation. He had arrived at a gate, and a woman had stopped him, not with a word or a weapon, only with her presence and her eyes and the gray of her morning dress, and everything that followed had come from that moment. The man he had come for was in the ground. The anger he had carried was resolved, not through confrontation but through something slower and more complete, through understanding that grief and debt and justice were not always clean, that people contained contradictions, that the best accounting a person could make for a complicated past was to live differently in the present. He had not collected the money, and he could not give Ruiz back his years, and he had made peace with both of those facts in the way that a person makes peace with the unresolvable, by setting them down and going on. What he had instead was this house, and this land, and this woman, and these children, and the spring morning light on the mountains, and copper still going strong in the barn at 12 years old, and Henry's compass still in regular use on rides across the open country. He had a letter from Ruiz's widow in a drawer of the desk Mary had bought for him. A letter that said she was well and her girls were grown, and she was glad he had found something good, and that she thought of Ruiz every day, but not only with sorrow now, also with the fullness of someone who was grateful for what she had had. He had a life that was deeply rooted in a place he had not known existed 300 miles and a long road ago, a life that had grown from the most unlikely beginning, from a grudge and a gate and a widow in mourning gray who had looked him in the eye and offered him supper and a place in her barn, which was perhaps the most New Mexico Territory thing that had ever happened to a man from Ohio who thought he was going to settle a score. He had settled something, all right, but not what he had come for. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, and Mary turned from the stove and caught his eye and gave him the look that was theirs alone, the one that contained all of it, the history and the present and the people around them and the years ahead that they were going to build together on this land under this sky. And he held his coffee and looked back at her and smiled. Outside, the Guadalupe Mountains stood in the clear March morning, blue and old and unchanged, and the windmill turned in the west wind, and the chickens moved through their yard with their purposeful foolishness, and the farm was alive with the good noise of a family going about its morning, and Calvin Garrett was exactly where he was supposed to be.